Hello, everyone. Welcome to the rescheduled implications of the Trump proposal to cut housing benefits webinar. We will get started shortly. Just really quickly, if you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat box available on the side of your screen, or incorporate any type of questions also in that question box. So we'll get started with an introduction from Elaine Weiss at NLIHC.
Thanks, Lisa. So yes, thank you so much again for joining us today, and sorry about the earlier technical difficulties last week that made it that we have to hold the webinar today, but thanks for joining. We will get started. We have a packed agenda. So speaking on our webinar today will be myself. I am the Senior Policy Analyst at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. Also speaking will be Will Fisher from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, Deborah Thrope from the National Housing Law Project, and Stanley Hardy from the New York City Housing Authority. So what's on the agenda today? We will provide you with an overview of the issue. We will also go into detail about the Trump rent proposal, as well as the Promoting Resident Opportunity Through Rent Reform Act of 2018. That is a bill that is a discussion draft that has been proposed by Representative Ross from Florida. And we'll also look at the local impact of the Trump rent proposal. So let's jump right into it, given how packed the agenda is. So housing benefits help struggling families get ahead and live with dignity. One of the biggest barriers to economic prosperity for America's lowest income families is the lack of decent, accessible, and affordable homes. Research shows that when people have a stable, decent, and accessible home that they can afford, they're better able to find employment, achieve economic mobility, age in place, perform better in school, and maintain improved health. If proposals to slash federal housing benefits would leave even more low-income people without a stable home, making it harder for them to climb the economic ladder and live with dignity. If Congress cuts housing benefits, even more families would be homeless, living in substandard or overcrowded conditions, or struggling to meet other basic needs because too much of their limited income would go to paying rent. When families cannot afford rent, they are forced to cut back on investments in their future, including education, training, retirement savings, and health care. Increasing access to affordable housing, on the other hand, is the most cost-effective strategy for reducing childhood poverty and increasing economic mobility. Investing in affordable homes generates long-term savings to federal, state, and local governments. Numerous studies have demonstrated that access to affordable housing and service coordination reduces healthcare costs and other expensive interventions for older adults, people with disabilities, and people experiencing homelessness. So let's look at some of the different policy proposals that these different plans are putting forward, and we'll look first at rent increases and what those do to folks. So we believe it's misguided to increase rent on struggling families who are already paying their fair share. Families with rental assistance are already required to pay what they can afford in rent based on their income. Charging higher rents would force them to divert money away from basic needs like medicine or clothing, or would put them at risk of eviction and homelessness. Rent increases, such as higher minimum rents or cuts to utility payments, target the very poorest people, including seniors and people with disabilities who are already at great risk of homelessness. Work requirements would only make it more difficult for families to get and keep their jobs. Research shows that for most families, work requirements do not lead to stable employment or a path out of poverty. In fact, work requirements are counterproductive and actually prevent people from working. Work requirements will also have the greatest impact on people with disabilities who need affordable homes as well as supportive services offered by housing providers in order to maintain employment. Without housing assistance, low-income people face a greater risk of eviction and homelessness, circumstances that make it incredibly difficult to maintain a job. Affordable housing and housing assistance are fundamental to employment and economic security. Time limits also don't reflect the reality of low-wage jobs. Imposing arbitrary time limits will only cut people off from the very housing benefits that make it possible for them to find and maintain jobs. Arbitrary time limits are especially harmful in high-cost areas and rural communities where rents are well above what a low-income worker can afford and where there is a severe shortage of affordable homes. Time limits will not address this structural problem. Only investments in affordable homes and job creation will. Additionally, these proposals undermine public-private partnerships, making it more expensive for the private sector to build, preserve, and maintain affordable rental homes. Imposing work requirements, time limits, and rent increases creates new administrative costs for housing providers without providing significant benefits to residents or the public. Housing providers will be forced to divert resources away from property maintenance and the employment-related resident services they already provide to pay for additional staff and regulatory compliance. Instead, Congress should enact proven solutions to end poverty. These solutions to help struggling families earn more and get ahead. This starts with expanding, not slashing, investments in affordable homes, job training, education, childcare, and other policies to help families thrive. Congress and the administration should instead expand voluntary programs like Jobs Plus and the Family Self-Sufficiency Program that provide services and financial incentives to help families increase their earnings without the risks and added costs. They should also evaluate existing demonstration programs like the Moving to Work program to determine the impact on tenants and outcomes before imposing across-the-board changes. They could also use HUD Section 3 regulation, which provides an opportunity to promote job training and hiring among people receiving housing benefits. And finally, Congress and HUD and Congress should work to implement the bipartisan changes recently enacted in the Housing Opportunity through Modernization Act that encourage work among housing beneficiaries. So what can you be doing now to fight back against some of these proposals being put forward? You can join the nearly 1,200 or more than 1,200 organizations from across the country by signing on to a national sign-on letter opposing these types of cuts to housing benefits. You could sign the letter using that link there. And if you have any more information, or if you need any more information, or if you have any additional questions, you can contact me there. And with that, I will now turn it over to Will Fisher to talk about the Trump proposal.
Thanks, Elaine. So, yes, I'm going to talk about the Trump administration's proposals, which were first were outlined in the administration's budget that they released back in February, and then were released in more detailed form in a legislative proposal and in late April. And so this next slide here shows or the one after that shows that they'll make major changes to rent rules for all of the major HUD rental assistance programs and some smaller ones as well. These are programs where most people today pay as rent 30% of their adjusted income after taking out some deductions, or they can be charged a minimum rent of no more than $50 if that's more than their income-based rent. So the Trump administration proposal would change this, first of all, by establishing a new bifurcated system where there's one set of rent rules for elderly and disabled households and one set of rent rules for everybody else. I'm going to start by talking about the new rules for non-elderly, non-disabled households. So the first big change for this group is that it would raise rents from 30% of their income to 35%. So this would be an increase that would hit the great majority of these households, and the more earnings or other income they have, the bigger their rent increase would be from this. The second change is that it would eliminate deductions from income. So families would be paying instead of 30% of adjusted income, they'd be paying 35% of gross income. And for this population, the biggest deductions today are a flat deduction for dependents and then a deduction for unreimbursed child care expenses. So this change would especially hit parents and particularly working parents. The third big change for this group is that it would increase minimum rents from, like I said before, no more than $50 today to $150. So that would at least triple the minimum rents that are paid by the lowest income households. And as this next slide shows, this would most of all target families with kids. So the majority of people in households who would have to pay these higher $150 minimum rents are children, and once you include parents, more than 5 in 6 of the people affected by this are in families with kids. So this would be heavily targeted on families with children. And there's a lot of families today that have little or no income. There's a lot of low-wage workers are not eligible for unemployment insurance. There's a really limited safety net for families with kids. And so this could have a really big effect on those people with very little income. As this next slide shows, a typical family affected by this would be a parent, usually a mom with 2 kids who has a monthly income of around $200. And so for them to have to pay $150 for this minimum rent each month would leave very little, only $50 left over for school supplies, for clothing, for any food or medical needs that aren't met by other assistance. So it would be really hard for a family like that to make ends meet and to keep their home. The next change that would affect non-elderly, non-disabled households is that this proposal would allow housing agencies and owners the option to end assistance for families that don't work a specified number of hours in a particular month or week, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But turning to the elderly and disabled side, it would, for those households, they would still pay 30% of their income for rent, but the deductions would be eliminated for them, so they would be paying 30% of gross income. Every elderly and disabled household today is eligible for a $400 standard deduction, so virtually all of them would pay rent increases. There's also a deduction for high unreimbursed medical and disability-related expenses. So people who have high expenses of those kinds would pay the biggest increases as a result of this switch to 30% of gross income. There would also be a $50 minimum rent for elderly and disabled households. And what this means would depend on what program they're in. So today, in the public housing and voucher programs, housing agencies can set a minimum rent of anywhere up to $50. So if they're at that maximum, this would be no change. But in the project-based rental assistance program, there's a $25 minimum rent now, so that would be doubled for elderly and disabled households. And then in the Section 202 and 811 programs, there's no minimum rent now. So for the lowest income people in those programs, this would be a straight $50 a month increase. Another big thing to bear in mind in thinking about these changes is that the administration is also proposing to change the definition of an elderly and disabled household for purposes of these rent increases and work requirements. So today, a household or a person is considered elderly if they're 62 or older. That would change to 65 or older. And also, currently, a household qualifies as elderly or disabled if the head or the spouse of the head or the sole adult in the household is elderly or disabled. But under this proposal, if there was even one working age non-disabled adult in the household, then the whole household would be considered non-elderly, non-disabled. So for example, if you have a grandchild living with a grandparent, that would be considered non-elderly, non-disabled if the grandchild is an adult. Also, if you had a 67-year-old living with a 63 or a 64-year-old, that would now be a non-elderly, non-disabled household. And so overall, more than 300,000 households that are now considered elderly or disabled would lose that designation, and so they would pay the higher rents, the higher non-elderly, non-disabled rents in this middle column here. And then the last thing I want to emphasize in talking about the proposals is that these would apply to current recipients. So there would be a phase-in that would be extended for the elderly and people with disabilities, so they would be phased in over a 6-year period, but current recipients would pay higher rents after that phase-in period. So those are the kind of the main specific rent changes in this proposal. Overall, these would affect more than 4 million households, which include more than 3 million children. The average rent increase would be $780 over the course of a year, which comes out to about $65 a month, but there would be many households that would have to pay much higher rent increases than that. Overall, this comes to, once it's fully phased in, to $3.2 billion in rent increases a year, and the great majority of that would fall on working families who alone would pay the majority of the rent increases, and then also the elderly and people with disabilities. When you add those three groups together, they together pay more than 3/4 of the rent increase. And these are all national numbers, but we have state-by-state estimates at the blog that has where you see the link at the top of this slide, and that's also if you go to the Center on Budget Housing web page that's right at the top of that page, so it's pretty easy to find there. So these are specific rent changes that the administration is proposing, but on top of that, they're also proposing to give HUD authority to make many additional rent increases and rent changes. Part of that is that HUD would be able to raise the minimum rent, so the $150 and $50 amounts that I talked about before. HUD could increase those without any limit. HUD could also design completely different alternative rent formulas that agencies and owners would be able to choose to adopt, and they could also approve formulas designed by the agencies and owners themselves. And so these alternative rent policies, for one thing, could mean big additional rent increases, but they would also mean that you would have this really complex patchwork system where thousands of different agencies and owners could potentially be choosing their own rent rules, which would be really confusing for low-income people and then also virtually impossible for HUD to oversee. So these are the specific changes that I talked about in detail before would by themselves be major changes to how rents are calculated in these programs. But beyond that, we just don't know what the full impact would be because there would be so much more that HUD would have authority to do. I also want to talk a little bit about some of the things the administration has been saying about these proposals because a lot of what they've been saying is pretty misleading. They've framed the rent proposals as being designed to encourage work, to help address disincentives to work, but the specific proposals that they put forward really aren't well designed to do that. So they would increase rents for virtually every working family in the covered programs. So that would mean that it would be harder for them to pay the rent, harder for them to keep their homes, which would in turn make it harder for them to keep jobs. In addition, by eliminating the child care deduction, that would make it harder for a lot of working parents to make ends meet. And then just by raising the share of earnings that workers have to pay toward their rent from 30 to 35%, that means the more they earn, the bigger their rent increase will be. And so if anything, that's going to also discourage work. The administration has also framed this as not affecting the elderly and people with disabilities, saying it would affect less than half of rental assistance recipients because it wouldn't hit those groups, and that's simply not true. Nearly every elderly and disabled household on assistance now would pay an increase that would be after a phase-in, as I mentioned before. And then in addition to that, equally needy seniors and people with disabilities who come off the waiting list in the future would have to pay higher rents immediately. So this is a proposal that would affect all demographic groups that are assisted through these rental assistance programs. The administration has also suggested that families wouldn't face hardship under these proposals because there would be exemptions for people that would be at risk of that. And it's true that there are provisions for hardship exemptions in the proposal, but those are designed very similarly to existing hardship exemption for families who are charged minimum rents in rental assistance today. And though that exemption ends up reaching just a very small share of affected families, partly because it relies on those families to kind of understand the exemption and apply for it on their own, and it ends up having a lot of people fall through the cracks. We'd expect that this would play out in a similar way under the administration's proposal. So the great majority of people would end up having to pay the higher rents that they would be charged under these rules, which would mean they'd have to divert resources from other basic needs to pay the rent. They would be at greater risk of eviction and of homelessness. So this would result in real hardship for a lot of people. And the last point I want to make is that the administration has suggested at times that they kind of don't really want to do these rent increases, but have to do it for budgetary reasons, and this doesn't hold up either. The administration has proposed really deep cuts in rental assistance in their 2019 budget, and then suggested that those would be offset through these rent increases, that would be kind of a way of offsetting the deep funding cuts that they're proposing. But that isn't true because very little of these rent revenues would come in by the end of 2019, so there's really no interaction between those funding cuts and these rent increases. But then the bigger point is that the administration and Republicans in Congress just enacted tax cuts that over a period of 10 years will add $1.9 trillion to the deficit, mainly to benefit the wealthy and corporations. So to then turn around and say that they have to raise rents on some of the poorest people in the country for budgetary reasons just doesn't make sense. So then my last slide here is on work requirements, and Elaine actually already covered most of these points, but I just want to reinforce that work requirements, the evidence suggests that they just aren't effective in bringing about sustained increases in low-income people's earnings. So instead, they would be likely to harm a lot of people who lose their rental assistance because of the work requirements. And that could include lots of working families. So, for example, the administration, under their proposal, would allow agencies and owners to impose work requirements up to a limit set by HUD. They haven't said what the limit on the hours would be, but previously they've floated 32 hours. And there are lots of people who are working but aren't able to consistently work 32 hours on a regular basis. That may be, they may get sick in a particular month or week, in a lot of low-wage jobs, hours are unpredictable. A worker may have to make themselves available for 40 hours, but end up only getting, 20 or 10. And so you could have people losing assistance even though they're doing their best to earn a living. And then the other point I want to make is that these are framed as being optional for housing agencies and owners, but that wouldn't always be the case, particularly for housing agencies. So once if Congress enacted legislation that allows work requirements in federal rental assistance programs, then state governments would be free to require housing agencies to impose them. So it's easy to imagine some state governments around the country that would want to do this and that could compel the housing agencies in their state to put in place work requirements, even though the agencies themselves may think that would do more harm than good, may not have the resources to do it, but they would still be required to do it. So I will close with that and turn it over to Deb.
Great. Thanks so much, Will. And thank you, Elaine and the Coalition, for putting this webinar together. My name is Deborah Thrope, and I'm a supervising attorney at the National Housing Law Project. And I'm going to provide an overview of a proposal from Congress that, like the HUD bill, will cut benefits for low-income tenants. So I'll start with an overview of the Promoting Resident Opportunity Through Rent Reform Act. It was proposed by Representative Ross, who's a Republican from Florida, and it really arose from a set of policy recommendations that was put forward by a group of housing authority industry professionals in that state. There's already been a hearing in the House Financial Services Subcommittee on Housing and Insurance in the bill on April 25th. And this proposal allows housing agencies to dramatically increase rents for tenants in public housing, project-based vouchers, housing choice vouchers, and properties converted through RAD. I'll also mention that the rent policies proposed in the bill would also apply to tenants participating in the voucher home ownership program. So the Ross proposal is really equally as harmful to HUD tenants, and in some cases worse than the HUD proposal, because it will raise rents and limit assistance for low-income families, including seniors and people with disabilities. So this chart here from the center illustrates the hikes in minimum rent that the poorest families could face under the Trump proposal and the Ross plan. And so you can see here that under the Ross proposal, tenants could see dramatic increases in minimum rents, upwards of $510 per month. And without any other support services available under the plan, the rent hikes will certainly result in housing instability, evictions, and potentially homelessness for many families. So under the plan, the housing authority has significant discretion to set rents. It allows housing authorities to choose from a menu of rent-setting options that they can then apply to different programs. And in some cases, housing authorities can even choose a different rent-setting method for each development within its portfolio. So specifically, housing authorities can implement unique rent-setting methods for individual buildings at public housing, project-based voucher, and RAD-converted properties. So this would raise significant oversight challenges for HUD, because it will be close to impossible to monitor individual rent-setting policies at thousands of housing authorities across the country. And I'll just note that in a recent report on the Moving to Work program, the GAO found that HUD had problems tracking rent-setting policies at the 39 agencies involved in the demonstration. So it's really unclear how HUD would have the capacity to provide oversight of this many additional agencies. It's also important to note that the plan would impact tenants who wish to exercise their portability rights because of this PHA discretion. So it would be very difficult for families to plan to move to a different jurisdiction because the family would need to understand and apply the new rent setting method that is in place by neighboring housing authorities, for example. And on top of that, the family's rent could increase significantly once they move if the new housing authority has a different rent setting policy. So it's really contrary to the key features of the voucher program, which are housing choice and mobility. So there are 6 different rent setting options proposed in this plan for non-elderly, non-disabled families. So I'm going to discuss those first. So the 6 different plans, the first one is that the housing authority could just continue with the current rent setting method, which is 30% of adjusted income, which allows families to deduct the cost of things like high medical expenses and child care, as we'll discuss with respect to the HUD bill. Another rent setting option is that housing authorities would be able to eliminate the flat rent option for public housing residents. So currently, public housing residents can choose to pay a flat rent that's based on comparable market rent in the area instead of an income-based rent. And this option was really created by HUD originally to diversify families with different incomes in public housing. And the idea is to incentivize people with higher earnings to stay in a development. So this rent method, again, would allow housing authorities to eliminate the flat rent option for public housing residents altogether. So I'm going to talk a little bit more detail about the tiered rent, step rents, and 30% of gross income options in a minute. But also want to note here that housing authorities, and one of the options on this menu is that they can actually make up their own policy. So if they want to design their own rent setting method, they would have to submit a proposal to HUD. But if HUD does not respond in 90 days, the housing authority would have the authority to consider it approved. So given the staff size and the capacity of HUD, it is likely that housing authorities would really set these policies without much oversight or approval from HUD. So moving on to tiered rents. So tiered rents are, again, one of the options available under the Ross plan. Housing authorities could implement these tiered rents based on income brackets. So you can see here, tier 1 would be for extremely low income families, which is families that are at 30% of the poverty line or 30% of the local median income. And then tier 2 would be families that are considered very low income, below 50% of local median income. And then tier 3 would be for low income, which is again defined as below 80% of local median income. So PHA would set one rent for each of these tiers, and everyone in each of these tiers would pay the same rent despite their earnings and income. So in theory, this would allow a tenant to earn more without having their rent impacted. But in reality, it creates really an earnings cliff. So as soon as the family earns $1 more than the income tier, the family would fall into the next category and see an enormous rent hike. So plus, many HUD tenants could see a significant rent increase under the plan. So in fact, the tiered rents would drastically increase minimum rents for many families. So that chart that I showed you earlier in the presentation, the calculations were actually based on minimum rents for the poorest families using this tiered rent method. And again, it showed rent increases upwards of $500. So next, step rents is another option available under the Ross plan, and step rents would be based on tenure regardless of income. And it would result in gradual increases in rent every 2 years. So as you can see here, it goes from 20%, 40, 60, 80 to 100% fair market rent every 2 years. So here the claim is that step rents will simplify the rent structure for HUD programs and that it will incentivize work because the family will see the benefits of increased earnings. Their rent would not be impacted. However, step rents are quite problematic because they don't take into consideration income, so some families will be paying, again, incredibly high rents under this plan. So there would be hardships available, but as Will discussed in his presentation, data really shows that most residents do not ever see the positive benefits of a hardship exemption because it's not made available to them or they're not aware of it. So, so the hardship exemption would have no real impact. And importantly, tiered rents also create a de facto time limit on assistance. So it essentially times people out of HUD programs because after a certain number of years, the family will be paying either market rent or above market rent. And as Elaine mentioned earlier, time limits really cut people off from the housing itself that will support work and can be especially harmful in those high rent areas with very competitive housing markets. So next, another option is 30% of gross rent. And this is really the last option, again, on this menu of rent setting policies. So housing authorities could base rent on 30% of gross incomes, which means families would no longer be able to deduct expenses like we'll discuss, things like childcare and high medical costs. And these are deductions for expenses that actually support families to succeed. This plan would also increase the minimum rent from $50 to $75. So $25 is a significant rent increase for many families, particularly those on fixed income. So the claim here, again, is that it really simplifies the rent calculations, but again, it's at the expense of huge rent increases to poor families. So those are the rent setting options for non-elderly, non-disabled families. Now I'm going to talk about rent setting options that would be available to housing authorities specifically for elderly population and people with disabilities. So housing authorities would have the discretion to set rents for seniors and people with disabilities at either 30% of adjusted income, so status quo, or percentage of gross income as determined by HUD. So HUD could censor rents for these populations above 30% of gross. And we have good reason to believe that HUD would do so, given their recent budget proposals, as well as the draft bill that Will discussed in his presentation. So the last element of the bill that I will discuss is shallow subsidies. So another thing that the Ross proposal does is allow housing authorities to use up to 40% of their voucher funding for shallow subsidies for voucher families. So what is a shallow subsidy? It's assistance that's based on 20 to 40% of the payment standard. And remember that voucher families, for voucher families, the payment standards are typically set at 90 to 110% of the fair market rent, and the tenants are then responsible for their portion of rent plus anything above the payment standard. So this would put a huge rent burden on many voucher participants. Now, the idea of shallow subsidies is to serve more families with the same amount of money. But poor families have a very small margin of error when it comes to monthly payments. So a shallow subsidy is really going to only help until someone's income suddenly changes, someone gets sick, or have high transportation costs for some reason for a month. So it will, no doubt, increase the rates of housing instability and homelessness among voucher families. It's also a major departure from how HUD has historically administered its housing assistance. So under the plan, families could refuse to accept the shallow subsidy voucher and stay on the wait list for the next available regular voucher. But if you think about it, this is really a false choice, right? Because you're asking very poor families to take a little bit of help now, which is when they need it, or wait for we don't know how long and accept a little bit more help, but at a later time. So it would be a very challenging decision for many families. It would also increase wait times for people who do not choose the shallow subsidy because there'll be less vouchers available overall. So in conclusion, one of the biggest barriers to economic mobility is lack of decent, safe, and affordable housing. This is what Elaine touched upon earlier. So HUD should prioritize solutions that permanently support stable housing for its residents and really employ strategies that we know are effective. So the rationale for a lot of these policies, the Ross proposal, has been to incentivize employment among HUD residents. However, there's little evidence, as Will pointed out, that any of these rent setting policies will increase work and earnings. And to test some of the policies that I've just discussed, particularly around tiered rents and step rents, HUD is actually participating right now in 2 separate demonstrations. So the first is the moving to work demonstration and rent reform, which is required as part of the initial 39 agencies. There's rent reform is being studied. It's also being studied as part of the expansion that was authorized last year in their cohort, specifically looking at rent setting policies. And HUD is also performing a rigorous analysis of these proposals in the rent reform demonstration. So it's testing out these policies. Hopefully we'll have some data on their impact soon, but to implement them wholesale is irresponsible without sort of knowing the impact. So we have additional materials on our website. We have a 1-pager on the Ross bill. Our partners have additional resources as well, and you can always feel free to email me with additional questions. Thanks so much.
Great. We'll now hear from Stanley Hardy from the New York City Housing Authority, who will discuss the impact of the Trump proposal on residents living in NYCHA housing.
Well, thank you. Again, I'm Stanley Hardy, the Federal Affairs Officer here at the New York City Housing Authority. Next slide. All right, so first I wanted to give you a scope of how large the NYCHA is. We serve nearly 600,000 residents on both our public housing and Section 8 program. Our largest development has 26 buildings with 7,000 residents. Our smallest development is a single-story senior building with 13 residents. Square footage, we are about 173 million square feet of space, occupies all of our developments combined. Next slide. NYCHA serves 1 in 14 New Yorkers. 79,000 of them are senior citizens. 38% are heads of households are senior or older. 100,000 children under the age of 18 years of age live in a NYCHA development. The average household income is $24,000. 53% of NYCHA residents are employed. Of that, our 2 biggest employment brackets are healthcare, which are your billing specialists or medical assistants. And then we have retail trades. That's 10% of our employed persons. And then 13% receive other public assistance. Next slide. Okay. The New York City Housing Authority partnered with sister agencies, the New York City Development of Housing and Preservation, and the New York City Department of Homes and Community, New York State Department of Homes and Community Renewal to complete the citywide analysis. We focused on 2 elements: the increased percentage of income paid for rent for all households who are not elderly or not disabled from 30% adjusted to 35% gross income, and the elimination of deductions for child care expenses and medical expenses, or dependent care expenses for purposes of income calculation. As you can see, when we ran our analysis for our Section 8 program in partnership with HPD, we found that both non-elderly and non-disabled head of household with no children average would receive a 20% increase, about $100 per month. And then we ran an analysis with non-elderly, non-disabled head of household with children, and we also seen about 20%, roughly about the same effect. Rent increases would affect 98,000 Section 8 households with a non-elderly, non-disabled head of household with children. About 24,000 Section 8 households with no children will also receive an increase. Over 35,000 senior citizens will face an increase of rent costs. Over 125,000 families in New York City rely on housing through our Section 8 program. Nearly half of them are senior citizens or disabled, and a quarter of them have children. Then we also ran an analysis on our public housing program. The average NYCHA public housing family earns about $24,000 a year, or if you divide that by 12, $1,750 a month. The average rent increase for non-elderly, non-disabled head of households with or without children is about $239 a month. Over 19,000 senior and disabled households would lose their medical expense deduction. Nearly 2,900 families with children will lose their child care expense deduction in New York City alone. The largest average New York City household is a 2-bedroom unit with an average household gross income of about $28,000. Over 55 households would experience about a $250 rent increase. Next slide. So we ran an analysis. New York City NYCHA family in public housing with the elderly head of household with 2 children and 1 disabled child or adult, making about $39,000 a year, would experience about $299 increase in monthly rent owed. Our partners, the New York Housing Conference, has developed a rent hike calculator. It does not save your personal information, so we encourage any tenants that would like to see how the Trump proposal would affect their rent. We encourage them to use that tool to see and provide a snapshot of what that a full implementation of this proposal would be. In closing, we know that PHAs won't be able to keep the increased rent. Elderly persons, 62 to 65, would be required to work. These are harsh proposals that would increase rents and have drastic negative impacts on families. So thank you guys for allowing me an opportunity to share our analysis.
Thank you so much. So that concludes the presentations from our speakers, and now we have time to take some questions.
So the first question is, which of the proposals need congressional approval and which can the Secretary implement on his own?
So these are all. This is Will Fisher. These are all legislative proposals. So both for rent increases and work requirements, the Secretary needs congressional approval to do those. So these are legislative proposals that would need to be enacted by Congress.
The next question is, what is the increase in rents across, or can you provide the increase in rents across income levels? Is there any information, resources that people can find that information on?
I think with the correct me if I'm wrong, Stanley, with the rent calculator, you could put in your income and it will tell you the impact on the increase of your based on your income, correct?
I believe so. So you can use the rent calculator by the New York Housing Conference.
Yeah, it's not, that calculator is not limited to folks in New York because the policies are a national policy being put forward.
Right.
And the next question is, where?
Yeah, go Deborah.
I was just gonna add, put a plug in for Will, the data available on Will and the center's website, because they've put together not only the state by state analysis, but they have a handful of graphics that are really helpful in understanding like the impacts. So I would also just put the plug in for that.
Great.
Where can people go to find how these proposals will affect veterans?
I think that gets back into the what is your income, because the proposals are targeting everybody. It's not whether you're a veteran or not. So you could go check out the calculator or the center's data to see what the impact would be on somebody who's a veteran. Unless they're looking for specific. Yeah, go Will.
So I was just going to say, so we don't have data to let us identify veterans in rental assistance, so it's not one of the groups where we can look at specifically what the impact would be. But we do know from other data that there are hundreds of thousands of veterans who receive rental assistance around the country. So when we're talking about proposals that raise rents on rental assistance recipients, they would definitely be one of the groups that gets hit.
And this is Stanley Hardy from NYCHA. When you talk about people on HUD-VASH assistance, HUD treats that as the same as a Section 8 voucher. So it'll be the same impact as a regular Section 8 person.
That's a great point.
People are unable to find information about the Ross bill. Could you explain why that is?
So the Ross bill is a discussion draft. So that means it hasn't been formally introduced. So it doesn't have a bill number just yet, but we have a fact sheet on our website under our benefits cuts page, which we will include in the email that you get at the end with the recording for the webinar. So we'll make sure that folks have that fact sheet.
And I think maybe the Ross bill's gotten another reason it's gotten less attention is it doesn't have the kind of specific rent increases that are in the HUD bill, so it's less easy to do a story on saying how much a specific family's rent would increase. But I think it's really important to say, like Deborah was explaining, that these, even though it doesn't have the specific rent increases like the HUD bill does, that it could result in rent increases that are even bigger and more harmful to low-income families. So it definitely is something that people should be focusing on.
The next question is, do smaller programs include homeless targeted programs like COC and HOPWA?
So I'm not certain about this. I believe that it affects the McKinney-Vento programs, but not the HOPWA program. But we can check that unless Deborah or anyone else knows the answer.
The Trump proposal does, in fact, change the rent for HOPWA. They added that. The initial draft that leaked back in February did not touch on HOPWA, but the proposal that they put out a few weeks ago does include changing the rent structure for HOPWA.
And to be clear, the Ross
proposal. It moves it from adjusted to gross. Oh, I'm sorry. It just moves it from adjusted income to gross income, if I recall that correctly. And sorry, go ahead, Deb.
No, I was just going to clarify that the Ross bill deals only with the programs I mentioned. So public housing project-based vouchers, housing choice vouchers, and properties converted through RAD, and then the homeownership program. But the homelessness programs in the Ross bill would not be impacted.
The next question is, does the bill only pertain to PHAs, or does it also apply to other programs such as 202, PBRA, et cetera?
Which bill are they referring to, did they say?
No, they did not say.
Okay, so
do you want
the Trump bill, yeah. So the Trump bill would apply to public housing, housing choice vouchers, project-based rental assistance, the 202 program, 811, the home ownership option, and like I said, HOPWA and some other smaller programs, rent supplemental, Section 236, I believe. So pretty much all the large housing programs. And then, as Deb said, that the Ross proposal is limited to public housing, project-based vouchers, and units that have been converted under RAD.
In addition to the deductions that you presented, are there proposals to eliminate the $400 and $480 allowances as well?
Yeah, those would be eliminated under the Trump proposal that would, as part of the conversion to gross rents, that would get all of the deductions, so including both the itemized ones like childcare and medical expenses, and then also the standard deductions that you mentioned.
Does that also
And
include
same with
the
the Ross
utilities?
bill. Yeah. Sorry, I was going to say same with the Ross bill. So one of the rent options would include the gross rent, and that would eliminate all those deductions as well.
And utility allowances?
Those would not be affected. So the Trump administration in last year's budget had a proposal to get rid of utility reimbursements, which would basically eliminate utility allowances for the lowest income people. And that was not included in this version, so that the Trump proposal would not get rid of those, or the Ross bill, I believe, in their gross rent option.
Yeah, that's right.
Will PHAs have the option not to change minimum rents if they want?
No, they would. This would be a change to a mandatory minimum rent, where every non-elderly, non-disabled household would have $150 minimum rent, and every elderly and disabled household would have the $50 minimum rent. And this is striking also because the administration has framed this as a plan that's intended to kind of empower local decision makers or increase flexibility. But in this situation, they're actually going in the opposite direction. So agencies that have chosen to keep a lower minimum rent would have to go to this higher $150 minimum rent and $50.
And under the Ross plan, the PHAs, the housing agencies would all have the discretion to do so. So everything would be within the housing authority's discretion, which, as we discussed, would be problematic because you could imagine it's going to lead to implementation, different implementations throughout the country at the thousands of housing authorities, right? There's, almost 4,000 of them. So,
are there any funds allocated for capital repair funds or the privatization of PHAs?
So none of the bills.
Go ahead.
Go, Will. I was going to say none of the bills. Yeah. sorry, Will. Go ahead.
The answer is no. That the bills don't provide funding for this thing.
Yeah, and that's an important point too, as far as the work requirements. They're not providing any funds to actually help implement these work requirements and help people get connected to better jobs, training, things that actually improve the possibility of them getting a good paying job so that they can move out of federally assisted housing.
Are the proposed rent increases applicable to the HCV program?
Yes, HCV and Section 8 are the same.
Are there any proposals on administrative fees?
No.
No. We would like increased administrative fees.
Would the proposals affect permanent supportive housing or mainly public housing?
Will, do you want to take that for the HUD proposal?
Yeah. So my understanding is that they do affect permanent supportive housing under the McKinney programs, and they also definitely do affect 202 supportive housing for the elderly and 811 for people with disabilities.
And under the Ross proposal, really the only project-based rental assistance that would be impacted is that buildings converted through the rental assistance demonstration program.
Has there been an assessment of how the multiple policy proposals, such as SNAP, et cetera, will have an impact on the families in the scenario of the presentation? So has there been an assessment of the proposals in regards to SNAP?
Oh, as far as the work requirements on SNAP?
Yeah.
I haven't seen anything. Anybody else?
So we have on our website, not stuff that's specifically about the impact on rental assistance recipients, but we have a lot of materials on talking about the proposals in the Farm Bill on SNAP and other kinds of SNAP work requirements. And we also have materials that talk a lot about the Medicaid work requirement proposals that some states have been doing under waivers from the Trump administration. So, but I think it's an important point that this is going on at a time when there's across the big low-income assistance programs, there's a lot of proposals to cut them or impose work requirements or make other harmful changes. And a lot of times the same people would be hit by all of these different proposals.
Do any of the proposals include the change which would affect legal permanent residents?
They would be affected. I mean, there are people who get rental assistance who are legal permanent residents, and this doesn't differentiate them, but it would have the same effect on them as it would on other people.
What happens to the single elderly disabled grandparent who is caring raising for 3 teenagers between the ages of 13 and 17?
So they would not be considered, so you said 13 to 17, so they would not be considered adults, so they wouldn't that wouldn't be considered a non-elderly, non-disabled household as long as she's over 65 herself. But they would be harmed by especially the change in deductions, getting rid of deductions, because this would be a family that would get the dependent deduction. It would also get a senior household deduction, and if she had high medical expenses, she would lose that as well. So that family certainly would pay higher rents under this.
And potentially under various rent setting methods under the Ross plan. I mean, it's hard, they're quite different, but under, a handful of those plans could potentially see huge rent hikes as well.
And they're a mere year away from being forced into that higher rent bracket once the 17-year-old turns 18.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Could you share the next steps for the proposal, the timeline, when is it expected to be voted on, et cetera?
Sure. So the Trump proposal has actually not been introduced yet by a member of Congress. We are definitely keeping an eye out on that. But the Ross bill has already had a hearing in the House Financial Services Committee. I assume that Representative Ross is taking that feedback that he got and is tooling around with the bill. So we aren't sure if the bill will receive, a markup where they'll consider amendments and they'll vote on it to move out of the committee. But that could happen, maybe in June potentially. It's still up in the air.
We have time for probably one more question.
Oh, go ahead, Deb.
I was just going to add, given that timeline that Elaine just set out and sort of the uncertainty, we're taking the position in NHLP that it's really important now to contact representatives if you are opposed to this plan, because there's so much in it and there's some sort of a lot of yes, there's the minutia, but there's also some basic principles here around rent increases and work requirements and time limits, so that, it's important that we make sure our representatives are paying attention. So I know the coalition has a toolkit. NHLP actually has a toolkit now that advocates can use to contact their representatives. We'd encourage people to do so sooner rather than later.
Absolutely, and especially sharing all the messages that we've shared with you today, getting to the point of, this notion of increased flexibility not really be doing what, the bill actually does, or this notion of increased flexibility is false. One more question?
Yeah, we have time for one more question, and that question is, do we know how these proposals impact moving to work jurisdictions?
They would still be able to set their own rent, so they wouldn't be directly affected by these. There are some moving to work agencies that use portions of the regular rent rules, and it might be that they would change with these changes to go along with that, but they would have flexibility to set their own rent, so they wouldn't be directly affected in the way that other housing agencies would be.
Okay.
And there are a few moving to work agencies that already have work requirements and mandatory minimum rents that are higher than $50. So it depends on the jurisdiction.
Well, that concludes our webinar for today. It's currently 4 p.m. Eastern Time. I want to thank all of the attendees for participating and all of the presenters for all of the great resources. This webinar was recorded and will be available on the NLIHC website at nlihc.org/events/webinar. You will also receive a follow-up email with this information that will include the recording and all of the other resources referenced in this webinar. We want to thank you again. Have a good day.